All right, we are live here with Peter St. Andre. This is our sci-fi dialogue number 7, I believe.
That's right.
We talk about various topics at the interface of psychology and philosophy. And Peter, I thought we would jump in with this. You have been translating Aristotle, which
Yes.
I am very excited about because I think translation is really important with these kinds of things. But how's that going?
Well, I was really on a roll, and then I kind of took a little break, so because I got busy with some family things and so on. But it's going. So here's my. I'll show you. I have a whole setup here. So what I do is I translate things on paper in a big notebook, and I have my large Greek dictionary and various translations that I see how other people did it. I'm translating a work called the Eudemian Ethics. Most people, when they read Aristotle, they read the Nicomachean Ethics. We won't get into all the details about why there's two books because they share some chapters. It's a very complicated story, but yeah, it's a lot of fun. You know, I like to do these things where you kind of, I call it an encounter. Yeah. So I read all of Thoreau, you know, and his journals and all that kind of stuff, and Epicurus. I translated some Epicurus and so on. So I'm doing that with Aristotle. And the best way I find to really understand what someone was thinking is to try to get at the original language. And I, studied ancient Greek in college. So I'm able to do that. I'm not super fluent. I can't just pick up an ancient Greek book and start reading, I'm not a true scholar, but it's a lot of fun, and part of what I'm trying to do is get behind I find a lot of the modern translations of Aristotle and Plato and people like that, they have a long history, right? So they originally got translated into Latin, Cicero and all those people, they would read Greek. And then the Latin translations got used by St. Thomas Aquinas and people like that. So then there were sort of these Christianized influences and Neoplatonic influences on translation of ancient Greek. And that kind of all got moved into, our modern understanding of things. So I try to get behind all of that and try to figure out, okay, what was the original sense of these things in Greek as opposed to all the interpretations that have accreted over the millennia. So that's kind of my goal.
Interesting. What do you find to be some of the significant differences between the translations that involve these kind of later interpolations and what you see as more of the original intent and context?
Yeah, well, words matter, right? And so what happens is that we have an understanding of certain words, like let's say virtue or soul, right? So let's say a word gets translated as soul. Well, we have this kind of Christianized understanding of what the soul is.
Oh, yeah.
And for Aristotle, plants had souls, animals had souls, humans had souls. So it wasn't this sort of, the soul was not something that was this imparted by God and was this everlasting thing, and you would go to heaven and your soul would continue to exist and all this kind of stuff, right? So we have, any understanding that we have today of a word like soul or virtue or something like that is tinged with Christianity, which post-dates Plato and Aristotle by over 500 years, and so on. So Aristotle had a very naturalistic idea of what the soul was. It was more of the aliveness of a living entity, you see. So if you kind of go back to sort of more of a pagan understanding and a naturalistic understanding of what Plato and Aristotle and people like that were up to, you can translate things like I might translate the word psyche, which is the word that psychology comes from, as aliveness instead of soul. Now that gives you sort of a biological, naturalistic understanding of what those guys were talking about, as opposed to this sort of Christianized, spiritualized, understanding of what was going on.
Yeah. Now, when you say biological, I think many moderns would hear that in a materialistic context
Hmm.
and equate it with physical. But my guess would be that that was not the sense in which Aristotle and others at that era, at that time, would understand that the word aliveness, would understand
That's
like
true.
biological.
Yeah. I mean, Aristotle founded biology. You see, I mean, he was the first biologist, and 30% or so of the works of Aristotle that made it into the modern era, because a lot of them were lost,
Hmm.
were biological works. But he didn't have a materialistic understanding of biology, because he was looking more at, how should I put this? The activities that living things engaged in: reproduction,
Hmm.
uh, metabolism. How did various living things survive?
Mm.
How did they perceive the world? What was their awareness of the world around them?
Hmm.
These were all part of biology slash psychology for Aristotle. Now, his, he didn't have, he didn't have our sort of modern understanding of things, right? But yeah, so his was not a materialistic form of biology. It was more sort of zoology, and looking at how um, living things behaved and how they existed in their environment and things like that.
Oh, so was there less introspection going on in that period? In other words, where was the place of the exploration of feelings, inner states, these kind of thing?
Well, certainly our modern awareness of introspection and things like that is much more sophisticated and more nuanced.
Hmm.
You don't get a lot of that in Plato and Aristotle and people like that. Now, they might have not written about things because they had a strong interest in self knowledge, and oftentimes it's complicated. Oftentimes I read a really good book on ancient Greek religion. A couple of good books on ancient Greek religion earlier this year.
Yeah.
One was a book called The Homeric Gods by a German scholar named Walter Otto,
Uh-huh.
and which was translated back in the 50s, this book. And he talked about how they would talk about the gods. I don't know how I got on this topic, but they would talk about the gods like Aphrodite, right? So Aphrodite was the goddess of love and sex and the physical erotic relationships and all this kind of stuff, you see.
Yeah.
So they would kind of talk in these metaphorical ways about the gods having an influence on you, in this sort of way. And uh, so they didn't really have they didn't have our modern psychological understanding of these things. They would have kind of a religious or divine understanding of these influences that came into you, right?
Mhm,
From
mhm.
outside, kind of. But they didn't have our nuanced understanding of feelings and emotions and stuff like that. It seems, but maybe they just didn't talk. They had that understanding, but they just didn't talk about it in this ways that we do.
Mm, mhm, mhm.
And this is you were talking right at the start about the interface between psychology and philosophy. So they would talk about things in a philosophical sense. Plato talked about love, and they had this sort of hierarchy of beauty, and you would perceive the beauty of another person, but then you would sort of rise above that into the beauty of ideas and the beauty of what he called the forms or the ideas of things that existed in another realm, perhaps, or something like this, right? So they didn't talk about psychology. The sort of psychological understanding that we might get out of the ancients would come more from poetry or drama and things like that.
Mm.
You know,
Okay. Yeah. how did they distinguish psyche from, uh, well, did they have a concept of psychology, or was that not
Um,
there?
yeah, I think they did. I mean, Aristotle was kind of the first psychologist, or Plato and Aristotle kind of were first psychologists, because they talked a lot about self-control, managing your emotions, understanding what your capabilities and capacities were, and not trying to go beyond that. That was a big part of self-knowledge.
Hmm.
Um, but our sense of psychology didn't start until the 19th century. So it's very easy to kind of anachronize, right, and say, oh, yeah, they must have had the same concept of psychology we do. No, they didn't. But they certainly were interested in psychological states, um,
Yeah,
and things like that.
yeah, yeah. Have you bumped into any special challenges in the translation work, or things that you have to spend quite a bit of time trying to suss out?
Well, I have thought for many years about how to translate some of these key terms, even before I started translating it. I'll call it rendering. Okay. So you have a word like psyche, and is that soul? Is that aliveness? Is it this? Is it that? Is the other? Another famous word is eudaimonia, which is the Greek word for happiness. I render it as fulfillment. Some people render it as flourishing. I don't like, we think we talked about this in an earlier dialogue. I don't like the translation happiness, because I think certainly at this point in the 21st century, we think of happiness as a feeling state, and a feeling of pleasure and satisfaction with how things are going, and it can be kind of a momentary thing. Oh, I'm really happy with that, those new shoes I bought, or something like that, right?
Mhm.
And that was certainly not the sense of eudaimonia in the ancient days. And Plato, people like Aristotle, they would have said, well, children don't experience eudaimonia because they just don't have the sophisticated
Yeah,
mental capacity,
yeah,
to have that perspective on life that would be required to say that someone has experienced fulfillment in life, or something like that. That's why I translate it as fulfillment, you see. So I've spent many years kind of thinking through how to translate or render some of these key terms.
yeah,
That my renderings are different from other people's renderings. I don't use virtue, I use excellence. I don't use soul, I use aliveness. I don't use happiness, I use fulfillment, and so on down the line, because I'm
yeah,
trying to mess with people's minds a little bit and
yeah,
break them out of the way that they think about these concepts. And if you use terms that are very familiar to people now, they say, well, they must have had the same understanding of that we do now. Happiness must have meant these pleasure states. Well, that's not really the
yeah,
case. I try to, mix things up for people so that they have to think about things, as opposed to just reading along and thinking that it was all the same back then.
yeah, yeah. I love that. In psychology, there is this issue with the translation of Freud. Um,
Mm,
that I read a book years ago by a guy named Bruno Bettelheim, who was a psychoanalyst. I believe he wrote the book in English, but he was a German. He was a native German speaker, I think.
yes.
And this book was written, I think, in the 60s or something. He said the standard translation of Freud at that time, which was done by this guy named James Strachey, was really problematic, and it gave English speakers really a wrong view of what Freud was all about. It's made Freud seem kind of intellectualized and uh, whereas if you read the original German, Freud's writing had a very literary flavor, and that he was considered a very good writer by famous like literary authors in German.
Mm.
And the name of this book by Bettelheim was Freud and Man's Soul. And so what he was saying was that Freud's thing was really much more soulful, like um,
Hmm.
and than what has come across to English speakers. Um,
Interesting.
yeah. So So yeah, that's partly why I think translation can be so significant, and mistranslations can really cause, you know, confusions and not
Yeah.
get across the real meaning of an original author. So I'm excited that you're doing this, and even just what you said about fulfillment is a bit of a light bulb for me, as it makes a lot of sense compared to the other
Mhm.
translations, given how you've described them as kind of understanding that concept.
Well, you can never trust the translator. Okay, the best thing is to learn the original language and read it in
Yeah,
the original language. Or you just
yeah,
can't
yeah.
trust translators. They're sketchy characters, right? And I am too. Okay? So don't think, oh, but Peter's translation must be better because he's a nice guy. No, I mean, if you don't know the original language, you have to look at multiple translations, which
Yeah,
is hard, right? Because you don't know the original language, and so you're trying to triangulate among the different translations you read. I happen to be a big fan of the Tao Te Ching. Now, I don't
yeah,
read classical Chinese. I don't know any Chinese, you see. So I
yeah.
have multiple translations of the Tao Te Ching. And there's a cool website that compares like 50 translations of the Tao Te Ching. You can go
Yeah,
verse by verse and see how people rendered these things.
yeah,
Uh, but, it's a fun project for me. So,
yeah.
um, let me, you had asked at my blog the other day, I had this post about
Oh, that's right.
starting this, and I had the word blessedness that I
Yes.
translated as blessedness, and you left a comment saying, Peter, what is this blessedness? So, so they had in Plato and Aristotle and so on, there's a different word for blessedness than there is for happiness, or something like happiness. So there's eudaimonia, and then there's or eudaimon, which would be the adjective, and then they had this word makarios, which we translated as blessedness or blissfulness or something like this. And Aristotle, at the very beginning of the Eudemian Ethics, says something about what makes it possible for humans to experience fulfillment, as I would translate it.
Hmm.
And then he has some parenthetical remark to the effect that, if blessedness is not to, how would I describe this? If we're not being too arrogant by saying humans are capable of blessedness, okay? Because blessedness was something that applied to the gods. And I was talking about this book called The Homeric Gods.
Yeah.
And in that book, Walter Otto talks, it's a great book. It was one of the best books I've ever read. If you're
Wow.
into ancient, if you're into religion and ancient Greek religion and stuff like that,
Wow.
really amazing. And so, again, I read that one in English translation. So what was it like in German? I can't vouch for that.
Yeah.
My German is not that good. So the Otto talks about how humans are fated. Humans are fated to die. Okay, we're mortal.
Yeah.
And along with mortality comes lots of other bad things: illness, loss, pain and suffering. Life can be hard, right? You lose
Mhm.
your loved ones, or you get ill, and your kid dies, whatever it is. There's all sorts of bad stuff that happens because we're mortal. Now, the gods don't. The Greek gods and the gods in general don't have all those problems, right? They're immortal. They can get injured. There's scenes in the Iliad, right, where which one was it? I think Aphrodite gets into the fray and gets injured by Diomedes or something like this in the Iliad, and she goes howling off the battlefield. But it's a temporary thing. She's not going to have any permanent damage. She's a god, or she's a
Yeah.
goddess, right? So the gods lived a blissful life. They didn't have to go to work every day. They didn't have to worry about paying the bills, anything like that, right? So they led a blissful existence, or a blessed existence. And humans don't, right? We die, we have all sorts of problems, and life is hard. So that's why Aristotle has this little parenthetical remark, like, well, you really can't say that humans live a blessed life. Now, they might have blessed moments, kind of like Maslow's peak experiences or something like that, right? If you're a performer, there's a concert that goes really well or something like that, right? And we have these moments of epiphanies and things like that. And we might call those nowadays peak experiences following Maslow. But Aristotle talks about that too. He talks about, hey, as you have this awareness of the beauty of the universe or something like that, you're studying, because he studied biology, right? He's studying these animals, and he talks about how there's a certain beauty in understanding how animals behave and how they work and how they swim in the waters and all this kind of stuff. So we can have these kind of experiences that the gods might have too, but they have them all the time, and they don't have to work at it, and it just happens for them because they know all, and life is easy for them. Life is not easy for us, so we can't really call ourselves, we don't have a blessed existence or a blissful existence.
So blessed and blissful strike me as two very different things. What I'm wondering is what does it mean to bless? Does blessed come from the verb to bless in Greek too? Because if so, then what is the blessing going on there?
No. Well, so that's one of the reasons why the translation is difficult. Okay, because when we think of blessedness, we think you must have been blessed by someone, right?
Or something, or some.
Right. I mean, God blessed you. We say, when you sneeze, we say, God bless you. What the heck does that mean? That means that, God is going to shine his beneficence upon you, and everything's going to go well. So that's why blessedness is probably not a good translation. I keep going back and forth between blissful and blessed on this word, because we have this assumption that the blessing, you must have been blessed by someone or something, right? But that's not the implication on what's going on with that ancient Greek term. So I might have to jigger that one around.
Okay. Oh gosh, that's interesting. So did they not have a concept of bless, what it is to bless?
Kind of not, I would say. One of the things that Otto talks about in his book on the Homeric gods is that, so for instance, there's a famous scene at the beginning of the Iliad where Agamemnon and Achilles are having an argument. And because Agamemnon has taken away, has threatened to take away Achilles's concubine, Briseis, okay, and which he won because he was a great warrior, and they sacked some city, and he got, basically this was how things happened in 1200 BC. Okay, so he basically got his concubine, out of conquering this city, and Agamemnon's going to take this gal away who Achilles was in love with, and Achilles was not happy. So Achilles was just about to draw his sword and kill Agamemnon, who was the leader of the Greek army, you see. And there's a scene. So how it's described is Athena, the goddess Athena, comes and tugs on his hair. Well, the Greek warriors had long hair at the time. This was an aristocratic thing. You didn't have short hair if you were an aristocrat. You didn't have to. You were an aristocrat. You had long hair. So Athena tugs on his hair, and he turns around and looks at Athena. No one else, of course, in the army can see Athena because she's just presenting herself to him. And he puts his sword back in the scabbard and decides not to kill Agamemnon. Okay. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean? We're going on and on here. I'm going to have to start asking you some questions. So what's the meaning of this scene? Okay. Is it literally that Athena came out of the sky and tugged on his hair, and basically gave him a very significant look, okay, and said, "Don't do this, Achilles. Don't kill Agamemnon." Okay, which is, our modern understanding of this would be, well, the goddess came down, intervened in human affairs, told Achilles what to do. Achilles said, "Okay, Athena, yeah, I'm going to follow your instructions here, and I'm not going to kill Agamemnon." Okay. Now, for the ancient Greeks, according to Walter Otto, that was kind of a metaphorical description of what happened, which was that Achilles realized, this is a dumb move, Achilles. You shouldn't have killed Agamemnon. And he exercised self-control, and he put the sword back in the scabbard. Okay. Mm-hmm. So now, according to Otto, there's two sort of the two descriptions, Athena came down from the sky and tugged on Achilles' hair, and Achilles, out of his own great-heartedness and and self-control, put the sword back in the scabbard and decided not to kill Agamemnon, are two descriptions of the same phenomenon. Okay, so it's not like one or the other is true. They had this kind of understanding that there was a divine moment there, and well, a goddess must have been involved because he exercised a divine level of self-control by not killing Agamemnon.
Yeah.
But they're really two sides of the same coin. They're not two different things. Like there's a divine explanation and a human explanation, though there were two aspects of the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, the blessed thing, like, okay, Athena would come down and kind of intervene, or this blessing idea is kind of an intervention of some kind by the gods.
Right.
And no, that was one way of looking at it. But another way of looking at it is you of your own accord did something that had a divine quality to it.
Yeah.
You see?
Okay. Now, yeah. So there's sort of two sides of the same coin. Now I can say, I have a question about this. I can say, I live in an apartment complex. I go back to my apartment complex. Now I don't own the whole complex, but
Yes.
it's my apartment complex in the sense that that's the apartment complex where I live. Now, when you say his own good judgment or whatever that was, did the ancient Greeks have a less kind of atomistic or individualistic sense of things, such that, yes, on one level that was his judgment, but on another level it was a kind of broader principle that arose within him, such that it's a little more easy to make that translation into the mythological presentation with Athena, because the arising of the principle of wisdom or strategy or whatever it was in that moment, it is part of is not just like inside his own body, but is a universal principle that arises within him.
That is very insightful, Adrian, because I would say yes, and Otto talks about this too, that there are eternal principles of the right thing to do. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not rules in our sort of modern Kantian sense, like follow the rules, and treat other people in certain ways, like that. But there are eternal principles of human behavior that need to be honored. And one of those is a level of self-control, and don't murder the leader of the army, or however you want to talk about it. And he kind of instantiated that eternal principle in that moment. Okay. And that eternal principle is also represented mythologically by the figure of Athena, because Athena was the goddess of wisdom. And right. So they're just different ways of sort of describing the same thing. There's this eternal principle of wisdom and self-control. Well, that must have been Athena involved, right? Because that's what Athena does. She's the goddess of wisdom, right? So Athena must have been in there somewhere. And that's that mythological aspect. But there's also these eternal principles of human behavior that you could look at it. They didn't differentiate between those as ways of describing what was going on there.
Is that to say that they didn't differentiate between the mythological and the scientific?
I would say so. Yeah. I mean, I think the secular and the sacred were kind of the same thing in some way, for at least among, at that time. Now, those things have become more differentiated over time. And we have this idea, well, the secular and the sacred are two totally different things. But I think in that context of Homeric religion, they were basically the same thing.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. And did Aristotle differentiate between the two?
No, because all of those, there was a little bit more of a differentiation sort of after Socrates, perhaps.
Hmm.
But basically, that was the premise of ancient Greek civilization that goes back to Homer. And Homer was not a person, Homer was just a name that we have. Now, he might have been a particularly impressive bard of these oral stories that they had, right? These were oral sagas that were told and retold. So it's not like Homer was this one guy who imposed his vision on
Yeah.
ancient Greek culture and society and literature. That was the oral culture that they had of these sagas, and so it really totally suffused the whole culture that they had.
Yeah.
That was the culture that they had. Right now, Christianity comes along. This is why I try to get back to this sort of pagan understanding of what was going on in these ancient Greek literature, because if we look at things through a more of a modern lens, we're not going to understand what was going on back then.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
so it's crazy stuff, I mean, I like this sort of thing, but it's a little bit on the ancient philosophy geekdom side of things. But I think it's valuable because we have this sort of understanding of things that's very much been colored by Christianity and developments over the last 2,000 years or 25, something like that, 2,000, 2,500 years, that post date the way that people were thinking when they were writing the ancient Greek dramas or or Platonic dialogues and all that kind of stuff. So if we don't understand the context in which they were thinking and writing, we're going to get it wrong. Just like you're talking about with Bettelheim, if we don't understand what Freud was writing and how he was writing and the context he was writing in, we're going to have serious misunderstandings.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I wonder how much Christianity itself has been influenced by translation issues, from the original, the original writings.
Well, I had lunch with a friend of mine some weeks ago, and she's Christian, and I was talking about something from college or something like that, and one of my Greek teacher was studying Aramaic, okay, and she had a dream. My Greek teacher had a dream that in Aramaic, which is another ancient language,
Mhm.
that God, this great voice came from the sky, said, "You will die," in Aramaic. So she stopped studying Aramaic. Okay. But then I told my friend, Aramaic was the language in which that Jesus spoke. Okay. And this wonderful good friend of mine said, "Oh, I didn't know that." You see, and
Yeah.
nothing in the Bible, nothing in the New Testament is in Aramaic. Okay.
Okay.
So there's no direct quotes from Jesus in the Bible, in the New Testament. It's all in Koine, which is a form of ancient Greek, kind of that post-dates classical Greek, okay?
Yeah.
So there's no direct quotations from Jesus anywhere in the Bible, okay? And then, of course, that all got translated into Latin because people didn't understand Greek anymore.
Yeah.
Very few people understood Greek. And so then there was the Latin translation, and the Catholic Church would have the masses in Latin, but of course it was all in ancient Greek originally, blah, blah, blah. So there's lots of translation issues, which I don't fully understand, but there's lots of translation issues with Christianity too, because all of these, and then all those things got translated from Latin into English and German. You look at Luther and people like that.
Right.
Okay, but they were translating from the Latin, not from the Greek necessarily. And then people started to go back to the Greek. It's very complicated.
Yeah, well, it is. Yeah, it's a little like a game of telephone, right?
It is. It is.
5 steps removed from from the original.
So let's we were talking the other day, Adrian, about my little translation project, but we were also talking about musical transcription because you've been doing a lot of that, and I thought that was really fascinating, and I think that could get us into another interesting topic. But maybe you could talk a little bit. This is not necessarily psychology and philosophy. This is more of our music side because we both do music stuff. Maybe just describe a little bit what you've been doing with your music, because I think that could be an interesting connecting point between psychology and philosophy here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, so I'm doing a little bit of a career shift at the moment, back toward music, which was my kind of primary focus a long time ago. And so I started taking piano lessons. I'm working on getting good at the piano, and my teacher proposed transcribing piano stuff. So what's transcribing in
Well, what kind of
jazz?
music is it? Is this like, Liszt? Is this Chopin? Is the what are you doing?
Jazz.
Okay, jazz. Okay.
It's jazz. So and I have a background in jazz, but when I was a kid, I was playing the saxophone. What transcription is, you listen to what someone is playing, and um, uh, and you either write it down. I mean, that's what transcription literally means. But a lot of guys will do what we call transcription without writing it down, but you figure out what the guy is playing so that you can play it on your instrument. And I
Hmm.
did a lot of this when I was in high school, when I was a teenager. You listen to a saxophone players playing, and I would write it down. That's what I always did when I was a teenager. The notes.
Yep.
It's a good form of ear training because you have to figure out what that guy is playing. I liked to do it without an instrument. I would just figure it out, kind of in my
Hmm.
head. It's like, what note is that? I would figure out one note, and then what's the next note? I would get from that first note to the next note in my mind by, singing to myself a scale or something. And
Yep. Yep.
it's challenging, but it trains the ear really nicely. And also you kind of get inside what that player is doing. Well, anyway, for decades now, I have struggled with developing fluency on the piano with two hands, play chords with two hands. I want to be fluent. I want to be able to say what I want to say what I'm feeling with my two hands. And I've never quite found a way until recently to do that. There's various systems. It's like, okay, here's this voicing where it's just all fourths, here this fourth to that fourth, and you practice it in all 12 keys, and you practice it in various different ways, or various systems that just never felt right as a pathway to developing the kind of fluency I want. Anyway, my teacher, who I'm now studying with the last few months, proposed transcribing piano stuff, and I said to him, because I had always assumed this couldn't be done with the piano. I did it with the saxophone. Well, you could do it with a melody line, but with two hands, I always assumed, well, that's too hard. You're not going to be able to hear that.
Yeah.
It's mixed in with all the other stuff in the mix. He's going to be, and I said this to my piano teacher. He said, "Oh, no, no, you can do that. It's like, yeah, it's difficult, but it can be done." So I was like, oh. And he said, basically indicated it should be done. Like you should be doing that.
Uh-huh.
So I went home and I started doing it. I went home and I was like, oh man, I really don't want to do this. But I sat myself down immediately and started doing it. And lo and behold, it can be done. It's difficult, but you can hear, you can
Yeah.
hear and you can figure it out. And I found it to be extraordinary. And it was the key that I've been looking for decades for developing this fluency. Because what it means is you figure out what some great jazz pianist is doing with his two hands, either accompanying someone else or playing on his own. And you get inside his musical world. You get
Yep.
inside his musical mind. And you learn it. It is fun. It's a lot of fun because when you figure it out and you can then play along, there's something very satisfying about it. But also,
Hmm.
there's some kind of wisdom that comes into you when you do that,
Ah.
that it's hard to even describe. Well, exactly what did you learn from you did that? I don't know, but I became a much better musician. This is what I was saying a couple days ago. I
Yeah.
spent 15 minutes that first day transcribing Chick Corea, who's one of the great jazz pianists. And I felt like every aspect of my musicianship was improved by like 5% from that 15 minutes. So I was like, this is amazing. So I'm doing that, pretty much every day for the last few months. Going through different of the great jazz piano player, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock, Brad Meldau, and now I'm transcribing Keith Jarrett, who I was telling you also the other day. It's like I've never gotten into just listening over the years. Like I try him from time to time, but I just never got into it. But I'm finding him the most fun of these four greats to transcribe. Maybe
Hmm.
because it's different and foreign to me, and it allows me to get inside there. But it's the most amazing practice, and I'm very grateful for my teacher for getting me to do that. But that's what I've been up to.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting because there's two things here. One is that's kind of what I'm doing with Aristotle. And I've
Yes.
done this with Epicurus before, right? Like getting into that person's mind, right? And
Yeah.
why were they, what were they thinking when they did it this way? But I've also done this. I've been studying classical guitar and learning these pieces by Bach. And my teacher, what I've been doing with him now, I'm not doing transcription, right? Because someone did the transcription, or those works have come down to us in written form. But what I do with my teacher is Bach was a world historical genius.
Yeah.
And why did he do things the way that he did them, right? So we look at what the chords were and the melody line and like the inner lines of the piece and the bass line and why did he use this diminished chord here, right? And where was he going? And like if you listen to the piece up to that point, there's a surprise for the listener, but it wasn't a surprise for Bach because he's like this godlike figure,
Yeah.
determining what the piece is going to be and analyzing the piece that way, and then being able to play it from the inside again. Now you have this inner understanding of the piece of music.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's interesting. Well, that makes me want to transcribe Bach.
Bach's all written out for you. You don't have to transcribe it, but I guess you could, right? You could I'm going to come at this fresh.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, look, some of the jazz stuff I'm transcribing might be written out already. I'm still going to transcribe it because it's that process of figuring it out to me that really gets you in
Yeah.
there.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. It's on a kind of, this is a bit of a loose association, but just yesterday I started listening to an interview with Bobby McFerrin. You know, Bobby McFerrin, you might remember him from the 1980s pop hit, Don't Worry, Be Happy.
Right.
But he is a brilliant jazz singer. Now, he doesn't like to be boxed into that, that label or that genre. And I mean, he definitely does plenty of stuff beyond it. But I kind of consider him the only jazz vocalist because he's the only vocalist who can really hang musically with other jazz greats like Chick Corea, which is that's to me a great the great album the two of them did together called Play. In any event, the reason I'm bringing this up is because
Hey, don't mess with my Ella Fitzgerald, by the way, because I was just listening to Ella Fitzgerald. I'm going to send you the link. Ella Fitzgerald doing an amazing scat version of Cottontail with the Duke Ellington Orchestra in 1965 or 1966. And I sent it to another from my musician friend. And he's like, wow, I've never heard that, because the way she integrated with the orchestra is just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. So there are, there are some very high level jazz singers who've been able to pull that kind of thing off. But Bobby McFerrin has a special place in that pantheon.
Yeah. Well, I'll check that out. I may be thinking in the context of kind of like post 1955 or 1960 or something like that.
Right. Sarah Vaughan and all those people. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm sorry I interrupted you, but don't mess with Ella.
No worries. No worries. No, I can respect that. Yeah. What was I just saying?
I distracted you.
Or you mercilessly interrupted me.
Hey, that's what happens in dialogues. You get interrupted. Yeah. You were talking about the way that he and Chick Corea were playing together. What else were you talking about? That was before that, though.
Well, okay. Yes, now I remember. Because of Bach, because he mentioned something about Bach. He said, and it was actually in the context of, because the interviewer asked him, like, I think, do you not think of yourself as a jazz singer? And he said, yeah, I really don't. And he brought up Bach. He said, people think of me as a jazz singer because I'll improvise solos and I'll scat. And he said, but if you listen to certain things by Bach, it was as if Bach would write these kind of lines for a vocalist that didn't have words. And he felt that was kind of like scatting.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I think he
apparently,
maybe sees
yeah.
what he's doing kind of in that context. Anyway, like I said, this is a little bit of a loose association, but
Apparently Bach could improvise 4-part fugues. You give him a theme, the right sort of theme, and he could just sit down at the keyboard and do like these 4-part harmony things, just really. But so the other thing that we were talking about the other day, Adrian, that I'm really fascinated with, and I don't think we're going to figure it out today because there's a lot there and I haven't read too much about it, is attention. Okay, so there's another ancient Greek word called theoria, from which we get our word theory. But I don't think it was, when we translate that as theoretical, I don't think we're doing the right thing either, because I like my different renderings and I render that word as attention. And one of the fascinating things that I think you're talking about with transcription and with this translation stuff that I'm doing is very close attention to the notes or to the words that I'm looking at in ancient Greek. And really giving a very strong sort of, it's like this laser focus on what's going on there, right? What's the thought behind that? And behind the notes or behind the music, the movement of the music, or behind the text that I'm working on. Because like you're talking about transcription, takes a long time. I spend an hour and a half on 15 lines of ancient Greek. So it's very close attention, to what that text is or what the music is. Yeah. And I think there's another thinker I haven't read much of, Simone Weil, and other people like this who have looked at attention as a phenomenon. And probably Maslow, I think, maybe talked about it a little bit as well. This real focusing of the mind. And we have, we think of meditation, let's say, or contemplation as a sort of a focusing of attention, right? Yeah. But I think there's a very active sense of attention that is very significant in life. And it's not, it's like sort of somewhere on the borderline between psychology and philosophy. And the only other thing I'll say about that, because I want to hear your thoughts, is that attention is also a very significant thing in relationships, right? When we're having these conversations, we're paying very close attention to each other. We're listening to each other very carefully. And I'm sure that's connected also with your therapeutic practice. I think this concept of attention is really fascinating and something that I'd like to dig into more.
Okay. Yeah. Well, okay. But my thoughts, well, so one thing is, with the transcription, there's a lot of attention involved. You have to listen so closely to hear.
Yep.
Especially with the piano stuff, because, there I'm transcribing accompaniment. That was kind of the first thing I did. This Chick Corea accompanying Pat Metheny playing a guitar solo. Mm-hmm. You just have to listen so close to hear, well, what's going on inside there in the piano, beyond the lead guitar part.
Yes.
There's a lot of attention. Now, on the other hand, I'm not thinking in words about what is he doing? Like, I'm not thinking theoretically, maybe modern concept of theoretically.
Yeah.
Maybe I should a little more, but so it's where I'm not. I'm just figuring out what the notes are, and then learning to play it myself. Mm-hmm. So it's a little like investing in learning a language. Like if I don't know, if I went to a foreign country, I guess this is not how we learn language, but I guess if you're a little baby, you probably really listen to what people are saying. Gradually, you kind of understand what it means. With music, maybe you already kind of know what it means because you can feel what the music is saying. Yeah. So I don't know if that's meaningful at all, but maybe it relates to a question I have of theory. Our modern concept of theory is so different to me from the issue of attention, because I associate theory with thinking in words. In a music context, I could think. In fact, just yesterday I was thinking I should maybe think about what is Keith Jarrett doing right here? Because this is something very interesting harmonically, and I couldn't tell you off off the top of my head what this is. Maybe I should think about it, but I didn't. Maybe I will at some point. But I just learned it and enjoy playing it.
Yeah.
And I assume that something about that is going to get inside of me without necessarily thinking about it. But I do think that kind of theory is probably essential certainly in jazz to understand, what the different chords are, or this is a chord substitution. You can, substitute there's a tritone substitution. You can, there's all these kind of.
Oh yeah. There's a lot of music theory in jazz, modern jazz. It goes on and on, all the chord substitutions and all that kind of stuff. Well, here's another example. If you ever go to a museum, okay, you might see an art student painting one of those masterwork paintings. Okay, they're sitting there with their easel. I don't know how they get permission to do that, right? There's a whole process, and they're sitting there painting the same thing that they see on the wall, right? And I've only taken a couple drawing classes, but I found it to be very tiring because I'm not a visual person. Certainly not painting. I wasn't doing anything at the level of those students, okay? But my mind was working in different ways, and there wasn't any theory involved, right? I'm just trying to kind of reproduce on paper. We would do these little grids, and you would, draw what was in the grid and stuff, like very unsophisticated, because I was just a beginner. But you think about what's going on in the mind of the student who's doing this, painting this thing over. I don't know what the term is that they use. And there could be there's a lot of just visual thinking going on, okay? Just like what you're talking about, there's musical thinking going on because you're trying to figure out the notes, right? You're not thinking about the musical theory, and the person who's doing this painting is probably not thinking about, hues and color values and stuff like that. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Or maybe they sort of go back and forth between a more perceptual level of awareness and a more conceptual level of awareness. And you kind of switch back and forth between the two. Thinking about things in that way and thinking about it in terms of attention, to me, kind of gets beyond this theory practice dichotomy that we have, right? Because you kind of have these two different kinds of perception going on, or you could, right? When you're doing transcription, like, what is that note? Oh yeah, that's got to be a diminished chord that he's using here, or something like that, right? And it's not like there's two different kinds of attention. Oh, there's the theoretical attention and then there's the perceptual attention. No, that's all just you as a human being perceiving different aspects of what's going on there.
Well, what is thinking? What does that mean? I'm not, when I'm doing transcribing, thinking a diminished chord or anything like that. It's pure perceptual.
Mm-hmm.
Is that thinking? Maybe it is. What does thinking mean? I always associate that concept with words.
Well, that's a big topic that I don't know too much about. However, I think that there are different forms of thinking. Okay. Like, I think there's probably musical thinking, and there's visual thinking, and you think about someone who's painting. Okay. I've been reading biographies of certain painters like Sorolla and people like this. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a kind of thinking going on when someone's, let's say, painting or composing or something like this. And they're not necessarily thinking in a theoretical sense or an explicit sense or a wordy sense, but I think there's thinking going on there. And I think there's sort of thinking, there's a kind of emotional thinking almost, where you perceive someone's pain, right? And you're talking with someone who's grieving or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. Where I think there's a lot of different kinds of thinking myself, and they shouldn't be limited. You think about mathematical thinking, okay? This is a classic example that Plato and Aristotle, people like that, talk about, where I'm not a great mathematician, okay? So, but there would be people, like Einstein had this example of, thinking about riding on a light wave, and that's how he came up with some concepts in relativity and stuff like that, okay? So I think there's a lot of different kinds of thinking, and it's not limited to the sort of discursive linguistic thinking that we talk about all the time.
Oh, so maybe thinking as meaning kind of mental work, something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Okay.
I
Mm,
mean, you think about like a great jazz improviser, okay? Charlie Parker, whoever, right? John Coltrane, whoever.
hmm.
They're not just like hitting the keys on the saxophone, okay? You
Yeah,
know, or Louis Armstrong or someone like that. They're not. That's not what's going on. I mean, they are so schooled in their instrument and in the kind of music that they're making
yeah,
that they're thinking, you know, I mean, it's a thoughtful process to construct a solo in jazz or something like that, right? But it's not like this explicit. They're not putting it into words. And in fact, music, based on my reading of evolution, predates language. So there's different kinds of thinking that predated language, I think, or that are and are still parallel to language. Visual thinking. You think about uh, ancient peoples who would go hunting, let's say. Okay, we got lots of examples here. So, you know, you're tracking an animal across the savannah of Africa, okay? And there's a thinking process going on there. It's not a wordy thinking process, but you know, there's a process. You're not putting anything into words necessarily, but oh, there was this, you know, this branch got broken here, and they maybe this animal there's a water, you know, there's a water source over there, and that's maybe where the animal's going or whatever, right?
yeah,
There's a lot of different kinds of thinking, way beyond our idea that it all has to involve words.
yeah. Okay, yeah. That's interesting. Well, so okay, that makes me think of another interview that I'm actually going to send you because I think you would find
Uh,
really interesting with Keith Jarrett that I listened to
oh,
yesterday. This guy sent me this trove of interviews. A jazz musician I know here in Austin that I've been listening to. But Keith Jarrett was saying now, on the one hand, he, when he improvises, he goes into almost like a kind of trance state. And he was saying
mhm.
he's like kind of gone, like
Yeah.
he describes it as drowning.
No.
Um,
Hmm.
and it came up in the context of, I guess, this interviewer and him at a different time had been together, and the interviewer said, maybe can you show me a little something of how you might improvise? And he said the honest answer to that question would have really been no, I can't, because I can't just go into that state for a few minutes. It's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I'm either going in or I'm not. You
Yeah.
can't kind of play around with that kind of thing. Was what he was saying. Now, on the other
Mhm.
hand, he did say that when he's doing a concert or a long improvisation, he said he will become aware of certain certain moments of tension or a sense of not going to a certain place that he will then go to when he has time to, or when the time is right to get into that space that needs expression,
Mhm.
which I take as an element of this kind of thoughtfulness that that
Yeah.
that you're talking about. Um, so my sense with with music in general is that there is this kind of two things going on. There's the sort of kind of trance aspect, if we want to call it that, or something like that, where you
Yeah.
you you go into something that isn't wholly about your own mind, but then there is also this aspect of control and knowledge that allows you to kind of shape things in a way that's
Mhm.
ultimately going to hopefully work as music, move people. And
Yeah. So this is connected to this whole idea of flow states,
yeah.
sort of trance state that you're talking about. And
uh
of course, a guy named Csikszentmihalyi um, did
Yeah.
a lot of work on that and made that kind of a concept. And he looked at flow states among rock climbers, among uh,
Surgeons, right?
surgeons,
uh
painters,
Yeah.
a lot of different fields he looked at. And I think this gets back to this idea that that thinking is a much broader term than we give credit for. And for instance, I'm speculating here, but you've done a lot of work in counseling and therapy and stuff like that. And I have to think that when you are in a conversation with a client, it's not like you've got all these concepts that are floating in your head. Now, you might bring those in, right? Like, oh, this sounds like, dissociation or something like that. Okay.
Uh-huh.
But it's more to me, probably, and tell me if this rings true, that you are in this sort of very deep attentional state with the person that you're working with. Okay.
Yeah.
And you're listening carefully to the nuances of their words, their voice tone, if it's in person or over video, how they're moving, how they're sitting, are they kind of jumpy or whatever like that.
Uh-huh.
And these are all forms of attention, perception, thinking, whatever you want to call it.
Yes.
So I'm kind of curious, how that works in what's your perception, inner perception after the fact of when you're in sort of a real flow state with a client, what was going on there.
Yeah. I do think it is like an attentional state more than an informational state, if that's
Mm-hmm.
the way to describe it. And I do think a lot of people have a bit of a kind of wrong notion of how therapy works, and they think that it's going to be, you're going to tell the therapist something and then they'll give you some information or advice or something like that.
Yeah.
Whereas, and there can be a little bit of that, but I think it's much more important than a lot of people realize is the quality of the interaction that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I do think that's more to the point of what's going on. Is it's deep attention, connection.
Yep.
And then, I do say things. We did,
Of course.
or guide clients through processes or what have you, or suggest certain exercises or techniques or what have you for dealing with this or that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the attention is very important. One of the most brilliant and kind of magical therapists in the 20th century was this guy named Milton Erickson, who maybe you've heard me mention him.
Yeah.
He was known as the Wizard of the Desert, I think, because he lived in Arizona.
Uh-huh.
And people would go see him, and he was very strange. He would do very strange things. It was very kind of like, what is going on here? But he was brilliant. He was an innovator in clinical hypnosis, and he had a different way of doing it. It was much less formulaic. Like, you were getting very sleepy, and now I will count from 10 to 1, and you will become more and more sleepy. That's kind of like formal approach
Yeah.
to hypnosis. And his was much more improvised, much more kind of personalized to whoever was in front of him.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to put people into very deep trances and then do things that would cause these transformations without them being aware of how he did it, which I experienced personally because I worked for a number of years with his kind of maybe foremost disciple, this guy named Jeff Zeig, who ended up founding and directing the Milton Erickson Foundation, which kind of educates people in his methods.
Yeah.
And I took those classes, but then I kind of worked with him one-on-one too. And he would do things that were very confusing. And then over the next few days, I'd find myself experiencing these transformations. That's clearly kind of had something to do with whatever it was he did. But Erickson was always kind of telling stories and using metaphors and not explaining them, like just kind of, just telling these stories, and then they would end up having an effect. And what Jeff says is that the best way to understand Erickson is through the lens of art. That Erickson was really kind of like an artist, and doing almost like improvised poetry or something that really had a very deeply transformative effect. But attention was extremely important there. The degree of just kind of focus was remarkable. And people would say stuff like they'd go and see him and they felt loved. And not because he was doing, I mean, he was doing strange things, but nothing untoward. But the degree of just kind of presence that he had with the person and attentiveness,
Yeah.
that was part of why he was able to do, to be so brilliant with the hypnosis, was that he could perceive like the subtlest aspects of body language. And some people said he seemed psychic, which he denied. He didn't believe in that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But he would be able to say, "Oh, last night, you had an interaction with your husband that went this way," and people would be like, "How did you know that?" And and he would then explain it and say, "Well, the way it was subtle aspects of their body language and stuff like that." He had polio as a child and was paralyzed for a while and was stuck in bed, and he entertained himself by very closely observing. He had a bunch of siblings. He would just observe them very closely and see what he could figure out about them. That is said to be part of how he developed that degree of sensitivity. But in any event, so yeah, I think that the attentiveness and kind of artfulness of that process or interaction is very important.
Yeah, it's very interesting you say. So I probably have her books here somewhere. Another person with a long name, Ellen DeSanayake, and she has a bunch of books about the arts, and she talks about. I have to go back and look at them. I read them a few years ago, and she has this idea of the arts, so let's say telling a story, as being a way to essentially focus attention. I don't remember if she uses that term, okay? But there's a frame on the painting, right? And now like everything else goes away and you're just looking at the frame, or there's someone who's telling an oral saga, Homer or someone like that, right? And there's a special thing, or you go to a play and there's the stage, right? And there's this framing that happens where the rest of the world gets chopped away, okay? And there's a special kind of focus that you have either as a performer or as a participant, or as a spectator, which is the spectation is related to this word theoria from ancient Greek. And where there's a special form of attention that happens, okay, in the arts. And that's connected to ritual, right? Because there's a special form of attention in ritual too. We've talked about that in the past. And you use the word love, and that's very interesting because a later book by DeSanayake, which I have not read, ties this to child rearing, essentially. But I haven't read this book, okay? And you're talking about Erickson, like observing his siblings and stuff like that. And there's a special bond between the mother and the child where there's I'm not a parent, okay, so I can't speak about this personally, but there's a special form of attention, especially between the mother and the child, of very deep kind of entrainment almost of observing the child and the child observing you and learning from you, right? And so she talks about this in this book I haven't read. And it's in all relationships. You go to lunch with a good friend of yours. I'm going to go to lunch here with my friend here soon after we talk. And where you're really paying attention, really listening to that person. And that's why I think it's connected to the therapeutic practice as well. There's a lot of connections. I think attention is a very foundational phenomenon and activity that we do as human beings in a lot of different contexts, whether it's work, play, love, music, whatever it is. And that attention has not gotten the attention it deserves. Okay, because I think it's a very foundational phenomenon and activity for human beings, and we don't have a great understanding of it. So I want to do some more reading on this. If you find anything, let me know. And because I'm sure, I mean, it's kind of there in the flow state stuff and so on, but I don't think folks have really pulled it out as a separate thing to really think through.
Yeah. Well, that's all very interesting. And it's interesting that she's DeSanayake, is it?
DeSanayake, I believe it's Ellen DeSanayake, I think is her name.
Yeah, this issue of framing, that's very fascinating because one of the central kind of principles of like Ericksonian therapy would be reframing.
Ah,
It's creating this different frame around experiences the clients have had. So
yep.
that's interesting. As regards material about attention, I think you might find Nathaniel Branden wrote a book called The Art of Living Consciously,
Mm.
which is, you know, has a lot to do with attention, and applied in a kind of secular context, as opposed to, I mean, the Buddhists, I mean, when I learned Buddhist meditation, it was framed to me as training in attentional
Yep.
training. But yeah, the Brandon might be relevant to that.
Okay.
But yeah, that's I mean, that's not something I've studied in depth either. It's just so very fascinating.
Well, I think of also like some of the novelists I like a lot. Okay, like George Eliot and Willa Cather and people like that. They Tolstoy's very good at this. I'm not a big Tolstoy fan, but the level of psychological observation and insight that some of these novelists had, especially in the late 1900s, I think they really cultivated this as an art. And I haven't read all of these people in depth, okay, but just the insights they have, and then they present them with these characters or these scenes and stuff like that. The attention that they must have been paying, to human interactions, kind of like in this Ericksonian sense, in order to then write things like that, is very impressive to me. And the insights that you get into those human characters that they're presenting, just these nuances about, someone just smirked slightly or something like that, all those kinds of things. That's, and again, this art form that these novelists cultivated, and it's just another form of attention to me, I think. And it directs you, as the reader, it directs your attention to these characters and their interactions, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot there, I think.
Yeah. Well, gosh, this has been a very exciting talk. We're almost an hour and 15. So does this feel like a good place for us to wrap up for
Sure,
today?
you're in charge. This is not, you do the odd ones. So, if you're in charge, if this feels like a good spot, then we'll stop here.
Okay. Well, yeah. Well, so then, yeah, Peter, this has been great. One of the things I enjoy about these is I will have like insights listening to as we're talking, and it's very exciting. So
yeah. Well, that's part of the point, Adrian. I mean, like the whole point of the sci-fi dialogue, right, is I've got perspectives from philosophy, and you've got perspectives from psychology, and we both have perspectives from music and the arts and stuff like that. And we kind of mix them all together and make this gumbo and see how it tastes at the end of the episode, and then the next time we have another cooking show.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. All right. Well, I guess then I will, I'll wrap it up. It's real good talking with you as always. I imagine we'll do it again in about a month or so.
I think so.
But for now, I suppose I'll wish you a good day and thank you.
Yeah, we'll talk again soon.
All righty. Well, bye for now.
Bye for now.